Okay, so this video will cover the self as social structure. Last time we talked about Mead and Cooley and their view of the self as a kind of communicative process that's unfolding inside our minds as a kind of conversation between the I and the me. Cooley doesn't explicitly call it the I and the me. That's a thing that Mead does, but both Mead and Cooley are using a very sort of similar model. Without getting too into the weeds, I will say that by the early 1930s, a lot of people are picking up on the work of Mead and Cooley, especially Mead, and it's informing a kind of the emergence of a new kind of sociological paradigm, which I mentioned in the last video and you've been introduced to before as symbolic interaction. The term actually comes from the work of a guy named Herbert Blumer, who was a student of Mead's and kind of built a methodological and coherent kind of theoretical approach in which he sort of lays out some of the assumptions of symbolic interaction, of kind of description of the methodologies that would allow for the interpretation or the analysis of that internal process of communication that's happening within the minds of people in society. And it begins to catch on with not, necessarily all sociology, of course, but with the people in sociology who are interested in that level of analysis, what we would call micro-sociology, it really starts to take off. And in the 1940s, kind of in response to this, there emerges a kind of revolution's probably too strong a word. There's a reaction to this by a number of social psychologists, a number of symbolic interactionists, who are looking for a more empirically rigorous, what they see as a more empirically rigorous model of social psychology and symbolic interaction. The symbolic interactionists working in that kind of tradition of Mead and Cooley and people like Blumer, they were doing a lot of research that was immersive. It was ethnographic. The methodology had been borrowed pretty heavily from anthropology, and it consisted of sort of describing and understanding social behavior in the social environments where it occurred. So a lot of observational research, very little experimentation, very little sort of lab work, and the kind of descriptions that came out, the research product was what we call qualitative research, right? It was very thick, it was very descriptive, it looked like narratives and stories, and not so much data and statistics and charts. And there were a number of social psychologists who thought, we needed something that looked a little bit more scientifically rigorous. And among those were people like Manfred Kuhn and Louis Zurcher. These are two relatively famous social psychologists who took a more structural approach to understanding and theorizing about the self. Sometimes we sort of, in a tongue-in-cheek fashion, we might refer to these guys as structural interactionists instead of symbolic interactionists. They are symbolic interactionists, but they're really, really focused on some specific measurable, what they see as quantifiable aspects of the self. Their overarching interest is in something called the self-concept, and the self-concept is this broad view that a person has of oneself, of themselves, I should say, as a physical, a social, a moral, or a spiritual being. In essence, this is the me in Mead's kind of I and me formulation, right? So when I think about me, the me is my sense of myself, right? So I'm the I. The me is my sense of the self. And I'm looking at that from the perspective of the I. So these guys are in essence interested in understanding what the me is. What is it we think about when we think about ourself? What is that? How do we quantify it? How do we describe it? Can we measure it? Can we kind of pin it down and identify it in some kind of concrete, more objective way? And they developed all kinds of different ways to sort of measure this. One of the really famous ones, one of the best known, is the use of something called the 20 statements test. Again, if you've taken an intro to psych class, you may have actually come across this. It does get talked about. The 20 statements test is, in essence, a self-directed activity. You're given a piece of paper or a form, and you are expected to complete 20 times a statement that begins with "I am blank." And you're not allowed to repeat. So I might say, I am a sociologist. I am a husband. I am a Cubs fan. I am a professor. I am middle-aged. I am middle class. I am short. All of these things. I might sit down and I describe myself. Right? I'm basically describing my self-concept, my sense of myself as a physical, a social, a moral, or a spiritual being. And what they did was they would take the data from these 20 statements tests and they would organize the responses into 4 different categories. They went back and forth, right? There's a lot of debate at the beginning. Are there 6 kinds of categories that we can use? Are there 4? Right? So this is just, again, it's all these things are social constructs. In this case, they're social constructs being built by academics and scholars. But generally, the agreement is that there are 4 broad categories into which you can organize or code those responses, those self-responses. We call them modes of self-response. So physical self-concept responses are ones that, not surprisingly, make reference to one's physical nature, being short, being middle-aged, things like that, right? So if I'm describing myself over the course of these 20 statements in primarily physical terms, then they would say that I have a primarily physical self-concept. Social self-concept responses are responses that identify categories that we belong to, socially defined categories. So being a sociologist or a Cubs fan or a husband. That would mean if most of my responses kind of fell into that mode, they would say I have a mostly social self-concept. Reflective self-concept responses are things like I'm an optimist, or I'm a cynic, or I'm skeptical, or I'm hopeful, right? Because those are kind of, they're not socially identified categories, but rather dispositions or orientations toward the world. So if you had a 20 statements test that was mostly full of responses like that, they'd say you have a primarily reflective self-concept. And then the last category is something they call oceanic self-concept responses. Now, these are statements that, well, first of all, there are any statements that don't really fit into those first 3 categories. But it's more than just like a remainder or a garbage category for anything that we can't easily squirrel away in the first 3. Oceanic self-concept responses are responses that don't give others a sense of how one might behave, right? All of those other things, like if I say I'm a sociologist, then people can anticipate patterns of behavior that might be typical of me because they understand what it is that sociologists do. Or if, if I say I'm overweight, they might reasonably assume that I'm going to, be more likely to want to engage in some kind of physical activity and exercise or diet. Right. So these other statements, whether they're social, physical, or reflective, have some implications for how a person might behave. Oceanic responses do not. So if I were to write on my 20 statements test, I am a child of the universe, which I could absolutely do that. What does that mean? Right? How would anyone looking at that be able to make any meaningful prediction about what kinds of behaviors I might tend to engage in, right? It's one of those things where the statements don't have any obvious implications for behavior. If that's the nature of the statement, then it gets coded as an oceanic self-response. And so that's, again, they've been collecting data on these self response instruments, these 20 statements tests, for a really long time, and it's managed to lead to some really, really interesting research. So, for example, this guy Louis Zerker, who I mentioned before, he came up with this concept of what's called the mutable self. The mutable self is a self concept that's highly adaptive to rapid social and cultural change. So one of the things that these researchers sort of discovered is that at various points in time in the United States, people tended to either have more physical self-concept reporting or social self-concept reporting, and it was sort of a function in many ways of the broader context, what was going on in the United States. So during the 1980s, there was a big, I know this is all before most of your time, but there's a really, really big craze for physical fitness, right? Gyms, that's when public gyms really started to explode and become popular, and fitness tapes that people would play on their VHS players at home, aerobics classes, right? Jogging started to become a really big thing. Sports, people were more and more engaged in recreational sports. And at that time, people were much more likely to describe themselves on these 20 statements tests in more physical terms, right? So the idea was that the broad self-concept of Americans was changing in response to these trends in the broader culture. And that was something that Zerker ended up sort of identifying as this notion of a mutable self. And what it suggests is something that's really, really important, very insightful, I think, on the part of these researchers, is that our sense of self, our self-concept, is a function of where we are. Right? It's contextually driven. So when people are given a 20 statements test in a college classroom, like in a social psychology or a psychology class, almost to a person within the top 5 responses, student. When those same people are given the 20 statements test in environments outside of the classroom, student might still be there, but it's much, much lower on the list. And sometimes it disappears altogether in favor of, maybe if it's being taken at home, your social relations with your family might be more present in the results of the research. Or if you're doing it in the workplace, your status as an employee. So one of the things we see as we sort of look at the research that's done with this particular approach is that the sense of self, our identity, is driven significantly by contextual factors. And what emerges out of this is something that we call an identity salience, which is a kind of hierarchy of identities. It is driven by context, but it is also interesting to note that when we have important identities, right, that mean a lot to us for whatever reason, we find ways to make those identities relevant in a wider range of situations than they may actually be relevant in. So a new parent, for example, may find every possible excuse to talk about their kids, right? Because being a parent is really, really important to them. And even if it's not relevant in the social environment that they're in, they may still try to find a way to promote that self-concept as something other people should be aware of because it's important to them. It informs their behavior in social situations. So a lot of really interesting stuff kind of comes out of the work of these guys. They do really important stuff on self-esteem and self-efficacy and other things that we're not going to talk about here. But in a social psychology class where we're doing more than just a broad introductory approach, we might really dive in and look at some of them. But these guys, although I will admit, this is not my particular flavor of social psychology, I do find a lot of the work that these guys do to be incredibly important and fascinating. It's all fascinating. So this is a little bit shorter, and I hope a little bit more easy to wrap your head around than reflexive behavior and the looking glass self. But again, as always, if you guys have any questions, let me know, and I will say take care until the next time.